Hello and welcome to Haman Nature. On this crossover episode with the great Bob Murphy, we talk about a very interesting little Twitter spat between two libertarian heroic figures, Hans-Hermann Hoppe and Javier Milei in Argentina. And we dive into the accusations that have been thrown back and forth, including a hilarious one, liberimbecile. Um, and we dig into the specifics: who's right, who's wrong, how has Milei been doing after a little over a year in office, and what can we expect going forward in the future. Enjoy.
Haman Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Haman.
Hey there, Bob.
Hey, Adam.
Did you hear the one about the German and the Argentinian who walked into a libertarian Thunderdome?
That's a Catholic and a Jew?
Like that, yeah. We are referencing, of course, the inter-libertarian squabble between one giant, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, and one upstart in the popular public opinion libertarian sphere, Javier Milei, and they've been sniping at each other needlessly. Why do mommy and daddy always have to fight, Bob?
I'm just impressed at how you made Hoppe as the giant, and now, the president of Argentina comes along as if he's got something to say.
He's a Johnny come lately, this new kid.
Yes, so for folks who don't know, Hans Hoppe, at his most recent event that he holds in Turkey, I don't know if that was like on the program or something, or if like people wanted him to talk about it, or he just decided to volunteer. But for whatever reason, I mean, he had written the thing out, so it was clearly prepared remarks. But Hoppe gave a pretty strong critique of Javier Milei's performance to date, and I think that was, I don't know. You looked at that recently. Was it in October or something? I forget.
Yeah, it was October, and I just, in preparation for this show, I hadn't watched it yet. It was one of my thousands of open browser tabs.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't watched it, and I was surprised at how big a hammer he took to.
Yeah, so I mean, why don't, just for the folks at home? So then the next leg to drop, folks, and the reason Adam and I decided this would be a juicy topic is because then Javier Milei fairly recently released, he was this panel of three guys was interviewing him. They were like fanboys, it seemed. It was all in Spanish, but
yeah,
from the body language and stuff, they were, and then what, boss? And then what, boss? And and Javier Milei was swinging pretty hard, and Adam, just so you know, because I don't know if you speak Spanish, I don't, but I had people confirm that the English subtitles that were put in the video were correct, and he really was. Javier was, calling Hans a liber idiot or something.
Yeah.
So, anyway, do you want to summarize, especially since it's fresh in your mind, what his critique was?
Yeah. He ended it a lot more nicely than he started. He ended saying that Javier Milei is closer to a Reagan or a Thatcher. He's clearly preferable to most politicians on offer. But since the guy ran, which is, the most amazing thing in the world, last year he ran on being a Rothbardian, Hoppian, anarcho-capitalist and won, which is freaking amazing. But since, Hans-Hermann Hoppe's name was mentioned, he feels a little personal attachment, like he's sort of responsible for whatever this guy does. So, he was very angry that the guy hadn't abolished the central bank, even though saying that's the first thing you're supposed to do. He says that while Milei has abolished price controls on rent, there's still a whole bunch of other price controls that are left in action. A lot of the subsidies are still in action. He fired 20% of the government employees, but even though he gutted a couple of hands full of actual departments, most of those employees just got reshuffled to other government departments. He was upset that not only were not taxes lowered, some additional taxes were created. Perhaps worst of all, he was supposed to be so good on monetary policy, and he kept the intercurrency transfer taxes, between dollars and pesos, which is just a huge mess. He was furious about him sucking up to the United States government, supporting Israel versus Palestine, supporting Ukraine versus Russia. I don't know how you feel, Bob, but personally, I don't care about stuff like that because it's just Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think they sent 2 helicopters to Ukraine or something as a symbolic gesture. But, from our libertarian perspective, I'm curious what he does internally, trying to actually fix the economy over there. So anyway, he says this guy's nothing like a Rothbardian, nothing like a Hoppian. And he takes issue with that being a comparison. It shouldn't reflect on us or him what Javier Milei does in Argentina. And then he ended it with saying, he wishes him well, but he's a Thatcher. He's not a Hans-Hermann Hoppe or a Rothbard.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. I think that's a fair summary. That lines up. I didn't rewatch the entire thing. I watched large segments of it because I do have a thesis to explain, partly at least, why are they seeing, because it's should I go into?
Oh, yeah.
What?
Before you do, just let me add one more thing because it stood out. Hoppe really emphasized how upset he was that Milei, rather than decentralizing political power, investing more of it in the provinces or whatever they call them in Argentina, that he was keeping power central. And then at this, almost in the same breath, he was acting like Milei could just shove all these libertarian policy proposals through as if he was a dictator and didn't have to, deal with the legislature or whatever court system they have there, or having to work through the provincial system. It was a weird contradiction, inconsistency, or I normally don't see that in Hoppe.
Okay, yeah. Unfortunately, I stopped the tape at that part, so I can't tell you whether I agree or disagree. That I think what he was saying is because I don't remember that part of it. I believe that he said those words, but I don't know. I can't remember that part of it. What I was going to say is I do have a lot to talk about in terms of getting rid of the central bank, because there I think they really just have different models in mind. What Milei thinks is, what it means to shut down the central bank. Hoppe was saying something else. But before we get into that, which I think will probably be the meat of this episode, Adam, I think and there was some pot shots people were taking because Hoppe was saying, look, I'm not an expert in Argentina. I've been there, whatever. And so then, of course, Milei in his response was like, hey, he says he doesn't even know anything about Argentina. So how, so there was that element as well. And I think it's almost like the vibe I was getting to is when people say the Beatles suck or something. You know what I mean? Like I think it's almost Hoppe's point was like everyone's holding this guy up like he's the most amazing thing ever. For example, like he gave the speech at was the World Economic Forum?
It was, yeah.
And I thought Hoppe had a good laugh line where he was saying that, yes, his speech was good, but I mean, they would never invite me there. There was nothing better than what I would have said.
I could give an even better speech if you would like to hear it.
So I thought, he got a good laugh from the crowd. So, I mean, there was that element as well, too, that I think you're right, Adam, that Hoppe's point was just this guy, it was amazing. He said a nice thing in the beginning, too, where he was saying when I was very impressed. I was surprised that he won given the radical things he was doing, and that was interesting. But and also he said something in the beginning like, I don't think we should interpret it that the reason Milei won is that the Argentine people are anarcho-capitalists now.
No, of course not. Yeah. He was saying what the truth obviously is. They are really screwed up. They had a sense that Peronism or whatever kind of version of socialism they were suffering under isn't working, and so they wanted something different. But he wasn't just saying gibberish words. He was saying Rothbard and Hoppe and anarcho-capitalism. And I was impressed not just how great Javier Milei is. I mean, we hadn't even met him or knew anything about him. I was just so amazed that in the worldwide culture or the Argentinian culture that wouldn't be just dismissed offhand as just some
Yeah.
lunatic. That was great.
Well, I liked it because when he was, I don't know if I think it was after he won the election, but before he had been sworn in, that he was on my map obviously before that
Sure.
point, but I was really going. Folks, in case you don't know, he won in. He's basically been in office a year as we're recording this. I think there were like several rounds of the election, like the way their process works, and then
December 10th.
Yeah,
So like 9 days over a year since he got sworn
is
in.
when he was actually sworn in. So, but they knew he was going to be the next one, like in November at some point. And so and I caught a thing on NPR, Adam, where like the correspondent doing the story, said what anarcho-capitalism was and had to explain it to the guest back in or the host back in, Washington or wherever the heck they were. So it was just, I was like, this is amazing that on NPR now they have to explain to each other what is anarcho-capitalism.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. And also
just,
I'll say someone sent me a clip. I don't know if this was from the campaign or after he won. I'm getting a little mixed up, but somebody sent me a clip that Milei was being interviewed, and this is all in Spanish, so like they're subtitling it. And he was talking about private law, and he said, the work by Murphy's chaos theory, and he was talking about Robert Murphy's chaos theory, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah, a very nice self-plug.
So it would be hard for me to really get upset with the guy.
Yeah. Fanboy number 4. You just were slightly off camera in that interview. Just to double down on how amazing an event this was in Argentina. Milei was a career economist. He taught for 20 years and then worked in private sector during that time too. And first ran for public office, I think, first time he won anyway, was just 2021. And that's when his political party, which has a name I should know, hang on a second. Here it is. La Libertad Avanza, which means freedom advances. That's a brand new political party.
Mm-hmm.
It came into existence in 2021 and only was a national party with Javier Milei coming into office. I mean, think of it, a brand new political party, as if the Forward Party, got invented and, 3 years later or whatever, somebody won the U.S. presidential, won the presidency under that. I mean, that could just never happen here, I don't think.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it was, and also too, folks, it's his. He was being compared to Trump and such as when he was running, that because he was like taking a chainsaw. He dressed up as a superhero, and he was like anarchist man or something like that. He was flying in, and like there was a song playing about anarchy and things. I mean, so he was a real character. He's got like a smoking hot girlfriend, and anyway, and there's stories about him being a real ladies' man and stuff like that. So he was a very bombastic figure in the campaign, and that's partly how he won. But maybe to give some of the context, partly the reason is because the Argentinian economy was in a shambles, and particularly they had very high inflation, and so that was partly why. What Hoppe's point was is to say, no, the Argentine people, enough was enough, and they wanted a radical change. And this guy came along, and was very funny, and
yeah, the Trump comparison is, well, first of all, it's the hair. They both got crazy hair. But then Milei spent a couple of years, maybe more, being really loud and outspoken on public television in Argentina, just going on all these panel shows and game shows and just acting like a maniac, but saying, you guys are getting screwed by the government, get over it, throw them out, use chainsaws.
Yep. So one thing I will mention is where I think Hoppe might have misunderstood the situation is about, it was coming out around August and September, and so I could see how if Hoppe like just was doing a review and then saw some of these stats or these charts, and then thought, I think when Hoppe was complaining about Milei, he said, I forget his exact words, but that inflation is still really high, and I don't remember the number that came up, but I wonder if Hoppe was looking at just the annual figure, because what happened is,
yeah, he misquoted the number, I think, because like inflation is way down,
Right. So the numbers are that it was like the last month of, like in December of 2023, when Milei just takes over, the monthly inflation rate was like 25%.
Right.
I'm not saying an annualized rate. I'm saying like in that month prices went up 25%.
And I think over 200% for the year.
Right. And then the monthly rate just plummeted, so that the monthly rate as of that I think as of November or December was down to the October. So I'm looking at the things here. I'm quoting someone. The monthly inflation rate for December of last year, meaning 2023, was 25%. If the latest available figure was 2.7% in October. Okay, so again, folks, these aren't annualized figure. That means in just October of 2024, prices went up 2.7%, which if you raise that to the 12th power, that's a
still
big number.
Bad,
but way better than what it had been, right? Like there was arguably hyperinflation, depending on your definition of that term, before Milei took over, and he brought it way down. But what was happening, Adam, I don't know if you saw this because I had to write a piece setting the record straight, is there were a lot of left-wing critics of Milei who were showing charts as of like last September, showing, here's what the inflation rate is, and they were looking at the 12-month prior rate.
Mm-hmm.
If you get what I'm saying, all right? So they weren't lying, but they're saying over the last year prices have risen such and such, and Milei's been in office. You know what I mean? And it was very misleading. But you can see the point that you could decompose the numbers. It's not just like theoretically it's possible that was unfair. Like no, if you looked at the actual numbers, that was a very unfair thing to say. That the reason prices had risen so much from September 2023 through September 2024 was because they rose so much in the last few months of 2023. Not because, if you get what I'm saying.
Critics were also saying something like, before Milei, the poverty rate was in the high 40s%, and now it's like in the low 50s. See, he's making things worse, without mentioning all the things that he's done that are way better. Government spending down, a budget surplus, inflation down, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so that's probably the biggest feather in his cap is he balanced the budget. So going into it, I think the deficit had been something like 5% of GDP, which for comparison in the U.S., that was roughly true like a year and a half ago. Was obviously the number was bigger in terms of dollars, but as a share of the economy, just to give you an idea how bad their deficit was. And then he balanced the budget and had a surplus in his first quarter of taking over, and has maintained that. And so I think did you see? Yeah, here we go. In a country whose budget was unbalanced in 113 out of the last 123 years, balancing the budget so quickly is by far Milei's biggest achievement. So here we're reading from, folks, it's an Econ Lib article. 1 year of Milei, stabilization, a balanced budget, deregulation in Argentina by Marcos Falcone. So there's that element. And another big thing he did was there had been rent control on apartments, and he liberalized that. I think he just like flat out got rid of it.
That's what I think so.
And it's like the supply of available units tripled over the summer, I believe. And so anyway,
and causing rental prices to fall.
Be careful. It caused the real rental price to fall, right?
Okay.
So which makes sense, right? Because if even with with a price ceiling, if it was possible for prices to fall, that would have been legal. So why would he take this, right? So what happened was, again, folks, remember, price inflation's still bad by U.S. standards. It just got a lot better by Argentinian standards. And so, before there was a cap on the nominal increase in the price. So he got rid of that. So the peso price of apartment units went up. But when you compared it to like the year before, the general price level had risen way more than the apartments did. And so it actually made apartments more affordable than they had been a year before. And there were 3 times as many available units on the market for people who are trying to find a place to live. And again, the reason that that's all consistent is that there was a general price inflation. So this is a case where the Keynesians could argue, it was a good thing.
Right.
There was debasement. Otherwise, that wouldn't have worked. But so
So before we get to the central bank issue, which I think we'll spend most of our time on, are you comfortable saying that you're use pencil not ink, but you're tentatively pleased with the direction that Javier Milei is taking Argentina? Do you think it's likely that things are going to work out, or does it look like a train wreck? What do you think?
So I don't know much more than just the stuff I sent to you that we read in preparation for this discussion, Adam. But I take that back. I know a guy who knows a guy, that kind of stuff, with a few different chains of reaching Kevin Bacon. I'll take it, put it that way, right? What's happened, that I was concerned. So yeah, when he first won, I couldn't believe it. Like, wow, a guy with that crazy campaign won. And then by about the summer, I was concerned because he was getting hit with a lot of protest, and the way his defenders, when he would do something like, say real complimentary things about the U.S. government, pay his respects to Israel, and, the stuff with Ukraine, all that, his defenders would explain that by saying, and when I say defender, I mean like people I know in
Sure,
the libertarian world.
Us.
They would explain and say, look, you guys don't understand in Argentine politics, or just I think it was more like South American politics in general. Like, it's so primitive that just to say, do you like the U.S. means, are you capitalist? Right. And so they were just saying it would be confusing, like his natural allies who wanted him to liberalize and have freer markets. If he came out opposing U.S. foreign policy, the defense ran, that would confuse people, and they would think that he was anti-capitalism or something. And so I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what people were saying. And
well,
then,
I'll tell.
Yeah, go ahead.
I started Haman Nature in February. We started talking about Javier Milei right out of the gate because it was fascinating. And what I said at the time is that he's planning on canceling that joining BRICS thing. Clearly, meaning he wanted to pivot back towards America and the dollar even more.
Mm-hmm.
And the United States has an amazing history of toppling governments that it doesn't like in South America. So it made perfect sense that he would fly to the United States and kiss the ring and just make sure that all he wants to do is try his internal, economic liberalism, and he just doesn't want to get railroaded by outside forces. It made perfect sense to me. I would do that, just for cover.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now I think I remember. I don't know if we talked about it on we weren't doing the crossovers at that point, but that I do remember you saying that. And then Dave Smith, I know his take was similar to what you said early in this episode, Adam, that look, it's not like Argentina has 6 aircraft carriers. So in the grand scheme, it's just words. It's not really a big deal. And also, like you're saying, kind of preserve his political capital. Like, the guy's got to pick his battles.
Yeah.
And he's got all these left-wing, rioters that he's dealing with at home. He also doesn't want the CIA trying to poison his food. So, yeah.
Reasonable concerns for an educated man.
Yeah. So just to keep in response to your question. So yeah, in light of that stuff, and then everyone just kept explaining why, oh yeah, he got it. You guys don't understand all the pushback he's getting, and that's why he can't just completely deregulate XYZ. And oh yeah, he wants to do and privatize all these things, but he can't because blah, 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 he's doing this for. And so I was just concerned as of like the summer that he was getting hit with a lot of stuff and everyone was mad. And then I was worried he wasn't going to be able to do too much. And then the economy was still going to be awful. And it was just going to go down in history that this ANCAP guy came in and everything was terrible and it failed. Like, so I was worried that was going to happen. I thought, at least let him do some crazy, quote, shock therapy stuff, and it's either going to work or not, but at least let him try. But what I didn't want was for him not to really do anything too aggressive from our standards, and then if it doesn't work because it's not really, it's kind of the same old, and then we get blamed for it and say, oh yeah, that's free markets for you. Like, that's what I didn't want. So I'm glad that I think he got enough through, and there's enough success stories that regardless of what happens at this point, I think, we can intellectually honestly claim that no, he showed you can come in, you can flip the budget situation around. Oh, and also they didn't get plunged into a huge depression.
Right,
Right, because
exactly.
that would have been a thing too. Like if he just came in and didn't really cut spending, then it wouldn't have been a good test either way. But he came in, like I said, turned the budget deficit right around, had the first surplus in a long time.
No, he had an incredibly narrow tightrope to walk, and he knew it. And everybody in Argentina, like the guy he just barely beat out for president, he wrote a book, that he figured he was going to publish in March when somebody had Milei's head on a pike and he was going to walk into the presidency, because everybody thought he was going to fail either by not trying enough or trying too much and not having, enough of the legislature on their side, not having the provincial governments on their side, not having the people on their side, getting tarred and feathered or something. So I give him a ton of credit for navigating a very hairy situation so far, at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's kind of my assessment. And like we said, the stuff with, getting rid of the rent control or whatever so it seems he really has kind of just like focused his fire on a few things that he had the authority and he thought the public would be with him to do. And those things worked well. He did them pretty aggressively. And those things worked the way, a libertarian free market economist would hope they would. And the other thing too is the public now still seems with him.
Yeah. 54% approval rating if the stat I looked at was accurate. Mm-hmm. That's pretty good year in.
Yeah. So I think that's all in all.
So if you want to turn to the central bank, one of the things Hoppe was criticizing, this was again October of this year. I believe he said in that speech that you could just end the central bank in a day and the fallout will be over in a week. Mm-hmm. And I didn't think that was politically true, a thing you could actually do in Argentina, but I was even confused at just the nuts and bolts of how he thought. Can you explain what Hoppe was thinking about getting rid of the central bank in a week and everything will be, running smoothly or smoothly enough?
Yeah. So let me just explain what Milei was thinking. All right, so I'll do that and then I can circle back. So Milei in his response, and that was the brunt of it, was he was saying, Hoppe is a liber idiot or something. I don't know exactly. The way they were translating.
I believe it was liberimbecile.
Okay.
I'm going to memorize that word and pull it out often.
Yeah, because I wonder if it's something like, how we have like our Lolbert, Lolbert, that people would say. That I wonder if what he was saying was like a clever pun or something in Spanish. But
it was translated liber idiot or something.
Yeah, right. That's what I'm saying. Like the translation wasn't particularly funny or catchy.
But but liberimbecile is pretty good.
Yeah. So anyway, and so Milei. But by the way, even there, folks, though, just so you know, like I was glad to see that Milei in the beginning, he didn't just say, "Oh, who's this punk Hoppe?" He said something like, I saw what he did, his remarks that he gave in Turkey, and they were very, shameful or whatever, and that was how it was being translated. So I don't know if he literally said shameful in his native tongue. And he said, so Hans Hoppe may be a good anarcho-capitalist philosopher and this, but as an economist, so even there, he was still kind of paying homage and saying.
No, even at the end too. Those fanboys are like, burn the books, burn the Hoppe books. He's like, no, the books are very good.
Yeah, right. So anyway, with all this stuff, they were still trying to, show that I recognize who I'm dealing with here. Okay, having said all that, the reason he was complaining, and by the way, my understanding is Milei, I think he has 2 master's degrees in economics, but he's clearly the speeches he gives and stuff. He's very well versed in the academic literature. I think he's got something like many dozens of academic peer-reviewed publications, and he also worked at a pretty high level for like HSBC, and so so he was really a banker, but also very academically trained and prolific. So he knows like mainstream mathematical economics.
And he turned, didn't he? Wasn't he a mainstream who read a little further and became an Austrian? I don't think he came out of the gate as an Austrian, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
No, I'm pretty sure at the 8-month ultrasound, they told his mom that you realize you have an anarcho-capitalist in your womb. I don't know to answer that, Adam. I believe you if you've read that. I can't independently confirm that.
It was a year ago, but yeah, I can't remember for
Okay.
sure.
So anyway, so he starts getting into transversality conditions. What Hoppe doesn't understand is that you got the central bank and then the transversality condition. So let me just explain what he's talking about. Like, what is that term? So that's a term. I don't know if other disciplines use that term as well, but the way I learned it and what it means in economics typically is when you're modeling a dynamic system that's going to be, and you want to kind of like go way out into the future, possibly let the time variable run to infinity, depending on what the model is. When you're trying to find like the optimal path, like if it's, I don't know, you're modeling the capital stock accumulation, like what's the savings rate? And, so out of current output, how much should be set aside to augment the amount of machineries and tools we have and things like that. In models like that, you can, play with the adjustment thing, and you want to just study the properties. And you want to know, like, well, what is the optimal savings rate then if we're going to model it that way? Because there's a trade-off, right? The higher the savings rate, the lower consumption is in the near term, but then the more productive you are because you have more capital goods to augment labor. So output's bigger, but, it's like 1 minus the savings rate is the share of output that's being consumed, right? So there's those kind of trade-offs. You can do things like that. And so one condition for an equilibrium is, basically taking the first derivative and setting it equal to zero and finding a local optimum, right? So it's called an Euler condition. And so but that's kind of just looking like little deviations away from whatever the ostensible optimal path is. The point is you're saying it's got to be true if we're at an optimum that slight deviations away from this aren't going to improve, the utility of the representative agent or something, right? Because if you could do that, then we're obviously not at an optimum, right? So that's the idea. But then they also have another set of conditions that is sort of like, a gut check. Like it can't be the case, the transversality condition and something like that would be the capital stock can't go to infinity. You know what I mean? Like, so they would do things like that. So it would just or like if you're modeling and saying, oh, what's the optimal size of the government budget deficit, right? Because if you have a government that doesn't get toppled, there's no reason it ever needs to balance the budget so long as the debt doesn't get too big. Like you can even have a deficit, a constant deficit, and that's fine as long as the economy's growing more than the interest rate. You could do stuff like that, but even there you can put in a condition saying, let's not let the debt as a share of GDP go to infinity. Like just the capital markets wouldn't tolerate that. So you can, you know what I mean? So you can kind of constrain it, and that helps you get an answer that pops out of the thing, because otherwise there's like an infinite number of solutions. So what Milei was talking about when he was answering Hoppe and said, oh, in the transversality condition, he was saying in the long run, if you're going to abolish the Argentina central bank and get rid of the peso, it has to be the case in the long run that the value of the peso goes to zero.
Zero, yeah.
And then he was saying, so now in practice, if we're going to actually, do it right now, like at this end state, that's going to be the case. And so he's saying, so there's two ways that can happen. One way is we unwind and we absorb and slowly make the amount of pesos go to zero. And so, yeah, it's true. We've satisfied that, check the box. The value of the outstanding pesos is now zero because none exist. The public's not holding any pesos anymore. The banks don't have any pesos in their vaults. So the peso's gone. And so that's why the value is zero. He said, but if we did it Hoppe's way, and we just got rid of the central bank, and now those pesos are just out there unattached to anything, and they can't be redeemed by any entity, then, again, it's got to be, you get to the condition, well, okay, since Argentina got out of the peso issuing business, it's got to go to zero. And so he's saying, so the only way that can happen if pesos are still in the hands of the public and in bank vaults, commercial bank vaults, is if their purchasing power goes to zero, which is the same thing as outright, complete hyperinflation currency collapse. So that's what his argument was at that part. If people, watched it and weren't exactly sure, like, what is he talking about? Why would, because Hoppe, so now to circle back, what is Hoppe thinking? Hoppe would say, what are you talking about? No, I wanted to get rid of the central bank to stop inflation. So what do you mean the value of your currency would go to zero if you stopped inflating? So I think here the big divide and why they're talking past each other is Hoppe is coming out of a tradition. Mises talked about putting the U.S. dollar back on gold. Ron Paul talks about End the Fed. And so if you read Ron Paul's book, End the Fed, he says at one point, he's trying to reassure the reader. He's like, look, this isn't as radical as you think it is, that the U.S. dollar existed before the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913.
Right.
Americans were using dollars well before then, right? There was the first and second bank of the United States that were like the Fed's predecessors, but they both got shut down. So there were long, decades-long stretches where there was no central bank, and yet the U.S. was a vibrant, growing economy with everyone using dollars. So in there, right, Ron Paul's point was, when I say end the Fed, don't think, oh, so now we can't use dollars anymore. I guess what are we going to do? He was saying, no, we'll let the Treasury take that function over of issuing the currency. And so I think that's what Hoppe meant. He meant, yeah, you can shut down the central bank and just transfer, its assets or whatever over to the federal government. And critically, for a few times in there, Hoppe was saying, and just don't print any more pesos. And he was even saying things, and it was clear Hoppe's envisioning a scenario where the peso is still an active thing that has purchasing power. It has, legal tender status in that sense, because he was saying, why doesn't he just liberalize it? It's real simple. Like, if people want to pay their taxes, let them pay them in Argentine pesos and U.S. dollars and euros. So clearly, if Hoppe is saying, why doesn't Milei just get rid of the central bank and let people pay their taxes in pesos, he's not thinking it would be demonetized. All right. But back to Milei, and I promise to let you talk right now, Adam, but let me just finish. The reason Milei, though, is so dead set in thinking, what the heck is this guy? I can't believe I thought Hoppe was supposed to be an economist here, is because a huge chunk of Milei's plan that he campaigned on was not just to get rid of the central bank, but to dollarize Argentina.
Right. So I was about to ask you about,
Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, both Hoppe in that speech and Milei, before he was seated, talked about dollarizing. And I think I remember in February, or maybe even January, I would see people, man on the street interviews for the people who voted for Milei, but didn't really understand what Austrianism is or what the specific economic reforms he wanted to make. They showed a bunch of interviews where they'd ask the guy, do you want Milei to dollarize and get rid of the peso? And they're all like, no, we didn't vote for that. So I was thinking that maybe he just abandoned that plan because he thought the popular uprising would just be too much. But I'm sure there are other technical real world implications. Maybe that wouldn't be a good thing to do. So what do you think? Why didn't he do that? What would be the repercussions?
Okay. So here, folks, we're going to show that we're not just two guys pontificating, that, we actually have the inside scoop on that one, Adam. Okay, so yes, Milei wanted to dollarize it, by which, again, he meant not just, make it very friendly currency competition, but literally transition so that the average person in Argentina is using the U.S. dollar. Not even, we're going to issue our local currency, but peg it to the dollar. Not even, no.
Get rid of
People in Argentina are using dollar, using money that's created by some other entity that they don't, influence. Then they're just bringing it into their country and using it. That's what they want to do. And by the way, this isn't a novel thing, in case it's not on people's radars. That, like, for example, Ecuador, El Salvador, and Panama have all dollarized, in the past as well. So this has been done. And they interestingly, they had different models of how they did it. So I had Nicholas Kachanowski, who is an Austrian. He's co-written a lot of papers, and they have assembled them into at least one book, maybe more, with Peter Lewin, in case people know him. And Nicholas, he and I have very similar research interests, so we get along well, and we like each other's work because he does a lot in monetary and capital and interest theory in the Austrian tradition. But he, with a co-author, the year before Milei announced his campaign to run for president, he and his co-author wrote a proposal for how Argentina could end their, close down their central bank and dollarize. And then, when that became hot, it was like their book came out like the week after, Milei was announcing it or something. So it was really topical and got picked up. And Milei cited them, like, on the campaign trail. And when people were saying, like, well, how could you actually do it? Is that just a slogan? And he said, no, go read the proposal by, these two guys. So I had Nicholas on after Milei won. I had Nicholas on, and folks will link to this in the show notes for this episode you're listening to right now. But I had Nicholas on at the Human Action podcast just to talk about this. And so there he explained the reason it was tricky. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on, but he said he broke up into 3 parts. He said what would be real simple is just to switch your electronic bank deposits, right? So the people in Argentina are going to the ATM. They look on Tuesday night. It's denominated in Argentine pesos. Then they go Wednesday morning and put their card in. All of a sudden, it's U.S. dollars at whatever the market exchange rate is, so that people aren't losing value. He said so that's real simple. He said then also to just replace the actual physical currency. And that's a little trickier because you got to come up with the actual, they can't just print U.S. dollars. They got to go get it. And so he was explaining, how could they do that? But he said the thing that was tough is, I don't know why they have this as the case, but it is the case before Milei even took over, that the Argentine central bank, they had a bunch of, let me make sure I say this right. A lot of outstanding, I think they call them like liquidity bonds. And so there were a lot of debt instruments that the central bank issued so that the public is holding that, and they had given pesos, to the central bank to buy them. And so it was like these debt instruments that were being held by the public inside Argentina, because I don't think foreigners, either they wouldn't want to own them, or I don't even know if they're legally allowed to. Probably they just wouldn't want them. Are floating around, and they had like a 90-day maturity, right? So the central bank just keeps rolling those things over, and in a sense that kind of keeps the peso supply much lower than it otherwise would be. Because what happens, right? You're some pension fund and you own whatever $1 million peso bond that the central bank issued. When that thing matures, what do? You turn that over to the central bank, and they have to they either roll it over and give it back to you plus some, a bigger number because of the interest, or if you just said, no, pay me, they would have to create the pesos to give you, because they're on the hook for that. They legally owe it to you, right? And so what Milei is explaining in that response to Hoppe is he's saying on the eve before, what's the guy's name, Massa, handed over power to me, he went in and, I don't know the exact mechanics of how they did this, but he said they changed it so that the average maturity of those bonds went to like 1 day, so that it was just like constantly rolling over. And then the other element he added is to say in the total outstanding value of those bonds was 4 times the monetary base. So what the monetary base is like the actual paper pesos, held by the public, and also the bank reserves, like the commercial bank peso reserves on deposit with the Argentine central bank. So his point was, if the public just turned those in and didn't want to hold it anymore, or if we just like shut down the central bank and liquidated all that stuff, he was saying the monetary base would quadruple overnight. All right. So anyway, so that was, which was to give folks an idea, like that was, kind of like what the Fed, that was probably more aggressive than what the Fed did during COVID in terms of what they did with the monetary base, right? So that was his point. So if we're trying to fight hyperinflation, or what is arguably hyperinflation at that point when Milei's taking power, he was saying, no, they really boxed me into a corner, and I had to be very careful with this, how we handle this.
No, I'm so glad you went through that, because I saw him talk about that in the clip, but it's Spanish, and I didn't understand what that word meant exactly, and I realized switching it down to a 1 day maturity rate, that had to be bad, but I really didn't know the mechanics.
Yeah, so anyway, so I still think, again, Hoppe could just say, all right, well, I'm just saying, transfer all that, the assets and liabilities over to the Treasury, get rid of this. Because Hoppe's point is he kept saying, just don't print any more pesos. And so, in terms of the mechanics of it, I think you could still do that. I'll just mention it since we're talking about currency reforms. Mises' proposal and he wrote this, I think, in the 50s, possibly in the early 60s, but I think the 50s, for how could the U.S. government go back to a genuine gold standard and really have a gold-backed dollar. Because the problem is if you just went back to like, you know, the official rate, like the classical gold standard of $20.67 an ounce, then that would have caused massive deflation, and that would have crashed the economy and whatever. And so his proposal was, or the flip side, if you had just insisted, well, no, let's keep the U.S., let's keep the gold price quoted in dollars or whatever it was as of 1958, but let's just get 100% backing. Well, then the U.S. government would have to go out and buy a ton of gold, or tons, to do that. And so that also would have been tricky. And so Mises' proposal, I thought, was very elegant, is he said, no, we freeze the creation of new U.S. dollars and we lock in whatever the market price of gold is. And he even gave like a lag to say, like, we announce the reform so everyone can kind of adjust. And then, starting in 3 months after that, whatever the world price of gold is measured in dollars over a 2-day average or something, we lock that in, right? So it's not your central planner and picking the price of gold. You're getting market feedback. And then going forward from once that reform is announced, he said, any new U.S. dollars issued by the Treasury, people have to come and physically hand over that amount of gold. And then they go put that in a vault. And so from that point forward, all newly issued U.S. dollars have 100% gold backing it, whatever that parity was, that was the market determined once the reform was announced. So going forward, the gold backing of the U.S. dollar would asymptotically approach 100%. And so you can see how that wouldn't really, so I thought it was a very elegant way. So I think, Hoppe is familiar with all these proposals. So I think in his mind, like, yeah, it's just a logistic. You just do that, and then you can ensure, either you don't print any more pesos, and so that's certainly that, that'll stop inflation in its tracks. You'll start seeing CPI drop. What are you talking about? And if the central bank's got a bunch of liabilities, okay, just transfer them. Now the government owes that, and they can use tax revenue or, well, you know what I mean? So I think that's where Hoppe was coming from. Whereas, again, Milei, when he talks about ending the central bank, to him, that includes getting rid of our currency altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. It brings up another question. Hoppe was upset that Milei immediately went and visited the World Bank or the IMF, International Monetary Fund, or whatever, making it clear that Argentina was going to pay its debts on the world stage. And I think Hoppe's opinion is that you don't, if you're an anarcho-capitalist or a libertarian, you don't tax your citizenry to pay these ridiculous debts incurred by a socialist government who's, stealing some of the money and wasting the rest. You should just not pay any of these debts. Boo-hoo on you. You shouldn't have loaned money to a crooked government. But it looks like, Milei's not going to do that. He's going to do some other thing. Do you have an opinion on who's tactically more, for the long-term health of the country of Argentina and its citizens? Whose approach do you think is better?
I do want to revisit that, but I just looked up to make sure I wasn't. What I thought you were going to ask me about was the gold, because that was another thing Hans brought up, is that Milei had shipped a bunch of the gold in Argentina out of the country.
Oh yeah, that's another thing. Yeah.
So what we do know is, yes, for some reason, a lot of the gold that the Argentine government controlled that was physically in Argentina left the country, under the approval of Milei, when he was in power. And then it's also true that, I don't know how official, the news stories are kind of wishy-washy, but there is some sense in which the UK is giving the Falkland Islands back to Argentina. So I have seen speculation that maybe that's what was going on behind the scenes, that Milei basically told, the British/Europeans, okay, here's a bunch of our gold. We're not going to default on our debts. We're going to keep doing that stuff, but we want the Falkland Islands back.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know that that's true, but I've seen that kind of a speculation. As far as debt repudiation, so again, I think it's partly a difference of the two traditions and where they're coming from. I think Hoppe might have in mind, for example, Murray Rothbard has written a lot on the ethics and the non-catastrophe of the U.S. government just defaulted on its debt.
Yeah.
In terms of libertarian ethics, it's like, put it this way, there's a much stronger case to be made that the U.S. government should pay people their Social Security benefits than that it should pay the interest and principal on people who have treasury bonds. Because the idea is, if you're a worker, the government is effectively pointing a gun at you and saying, "Oh, we're going to make you save for your retirement. Here, you give us those, contributions out of your paycheck. We'll go manage it on your behalf." Of course, they're just spending it, but
Yeah.
and then down the road, when you turn, and you're in 60s and you start drawing retirement, we'll pay you then, and you might even get, depending on the demographics and whatever, you might even have a little bit of a return. Nothing what you'd get if you put it in the market, but still. But there you don't have a choice. Right?
Strictly speaking, spending is a way to manage.
Yes, it is. Yeah, they didn't lie. Whereas the people who lend money to the government by buying bonds, that was voluntary, right? The government is not forcing, outside of war situations and whatever, the government's not forcing the corporations and pension funds and blah, blah, blah to lend money by buying treasuries. That's just, it's considered to be a very safe investment. You can lock that return. But strictly speaking, if the government were to default, hey, that's what you get for lending money to an empire, that's running the world and, blowing up kids in Gaza with their money, so that's kind of in terms of the libertarian ethics of it. And then also he thought, and Jeffrey Rogers Hummel has also written a lot on this too, that it's overblown. People are like, oh my gosh, the whole global financial system would collapse if the U.S. government defaulted. And I've seen a lot of people like arguing, well, no, it's just it's stopping the transfer of money from U.S. taxpayers to these. You know what I mean? It's not like it would literally blow up bridges and
for certain people.
Farmland.
For certain people, it would go very nastily.
and then the idea being, and there would be a lesson learned, and then maybe it would make it harder for the U.S. government to borrow, so it would constrain its spending, which would certainly be good. So anyway,
sounds like
there's that stuff, right? So I think that's partly, what Hoppe's, where he's coming from when he's talking about that. I think where Milei, though, is coming from is that they have had to borrow in other people's currencies, right? So for a long time, because the Argentine peso was so unstable, that foreign investors aren't going to lend to their government denominated in their own currency. They're going to lend to them denominated in US dollars or euros or whatever. So that's an extra layer. And it's the kind of thing like that. The discipline of the market is already there in that sense, locking them in, that they can't just inflate their way out of their debts. And then again, in terms of just an outright default, given that what Milei wants to do is to bring in U.S. dollars so that his people. Oh, one other thing I meant to mention: they're already using the U.S. dollar, right? Because of the hyperinflation that over the last span. Like a lot of the people already have switched over. So that's partly, the Milei's case and, Nicholas, when I was interviewing on this. So that's what he was saying. It's not that this is being foisted on them. This is just kind of acknowledging what's going on, either like out in the open or in the black markets. And so,
or people keeping their savings, whatever they have, they're keeping in something that's not going to appreciate as fast as the.
But just to finish the train of thought. So all I was saying is, given that he's trying to like unwind his central bank and not have a panic and not have everyone try to redeem those bonds, like they said, that are 4 times the monetary base. All this other, you got to keep foreign investment coming in. They're doing everything they can to court companies that can bring U.S. dollars in.
Yeah.
So in that environment, if that's what you got to do, you probably don't want to just piss off all the major
I think Hoppe was
financial
wrong.
institutions.
I think Hoppe was 100% wrong, and it's what I alluded to earlier. This is Argentina talking about, not the United States with its military might. He needs to stay cozy with the West in general to not get regime change. So he can't just tell all these foreign lenders to just go bugger off. Yeah. I mean, he'll get CIA'd immediately.
Yeah, I mean that's the right in terms of like socialist regimes that would nationalize, banana companies.
Exactly.
I'm not even making that argument. I mean, you're right. That could be the ultimate thing that, I got to watch out for that. But even short of that, just in general, he kind of needs to build bridges and to liberalize and bring in investment and stuff like that, and probably just defaulting on all of the government's debt to these international institutions might not make that.
For sure, you're right. In fact, in that article you shared, to try and make foreign companies want to invest, he did some sort of $200 million incentive package to try and make them overlook the fact that like currency conversion taxation thing was in effect. I didn't see the details in the article, but clearly, you're right. He wants to make Argentina an attractive place for people to invest, and he's trying to figure out ways to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I had one.
If I could say one last thing on that too, what Nicholas, because I went and reviewed the conversation I had with Nicholas from a year ago in preparation for talking to you, Adam, and that was one of the things he brought up. Like, what was their solution? It was real complex, and at the time, I didn't even really fully process it, and now I made myself listen more because I realized, oh, this is very, very relevant. But one of their solutions, like for how do we deal with this? You know, the Argentina central bank has all these liabilities. What do we do? And they wanted to create like a trust, and they move all the stuff into a trust, and they got to pay it down over time. And then one of the ways, like they could bring in, you know, they got to pay those people off, and so you got to have a cash flow stream to be able to divert. You know, if the Argentine central bank is no longer in business, so you can't just create pesos out of thin air. Where you're getting them from. And that was one of the sources they said is, oh, right now, anytime someone wants to, like a farmer wants to export agricultural products to the global market, going in and out of the Forex markets, they have to pay a tax. You know, this is Nicholas telling me just how the situation was. And so he said in our proposal in our book, we said, okay, well, you could redirect some of that tax revenue into this trust to sort of, you know, start whittling down this huge debt that we owe to shrink those bonds to get them manageable before you can just kind of subsume them back into the general government, you know, debt or something. So I'm saying that might be partly why if Hoppe's saying, yeah, you still got all these currency controls and all these taxes every time somebody wants to export, what the heck is it? It might be because in their mind they're saying we need to keep this in motion because the guys we relied on for the blueprint of how do we get rid of the central bank said you're going to need a source of pesos. And rather than levying a new tax or something, why don't you just redirect this tax that's already up and running to the, you know, anyway, that's just.
No, that makes sense. So, like I said before, a very narrow tightrope to try and navigate. I had one other thing Milei said in his response to Hoppe that was funny, and also I didn't understand it perfectly, so I want to throw it by you. He said Hoppe has no understanding of monetary theory, specifically stocks and flows, and then he called him a liberimbecile again, which made me laugh again. Does that criticism hold any weight, or is mommy just being mad at daddy?
So there, again, that was right in the same place where he was talking about the transversality conditions and all that stuff. So I don't have a separate thing to say to you like, oh yeah, for that, what he had in mind was blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? I would just say the basic stuff that I've been talking about with what he's realizing to get rid of the central bank, and we got these liquidity bonds that are out there and . So it may just be, you know, he was thinking, Hoppe just thinks it's a simple matter of, oh, just stop printing pesos, but no, because we got these bonds that are maturing and we got to keep rolling them over. And how do we do that if the central bank doesn't exist? And so maybe he is just talking about that, like at any moment, like the stock of the value of the, you know, the outstanding. Because that's what he said too. He said, right, the pesos in an accounting sense are a liability of the central bank, which is true. And again, Milei's coming out of investment banking, so that's how he's thinking of stuff. So I think it's possible he had that in mind where, you know, Hoppe's just thinking about like, well, right now on this date, there's this many pesos, and then we just stop physically printing more, and there you go, inflation solved. And Milei's thinking more of it as like banking operations where there's interest that's accruing over time and stuff like that, and the liabilities are growing. I'm speculating. I'm not sure because, again, it was a short clip and it was in Spanish, but I think that was the kind of stuff he had in mind where he was just saying that, no, it's not like this is just a printing press and the government goes out and pays the troops with newly printed cash. And if we just stop doing that, then prices stop rising. It's a bank, and you know, it's got a balance sheet, and we got to deal with that.
Yeah, good stuff. I'm hoping that this is all just fabricated drama and it's not even real. They're probably just spicing up interest for releasing a sex tape, Hoppe and Milei, here in the next couple of months or so.
I don't hope that that's what's happening.
It may be a perverse thing on my side. Do you have anything more you want to say about this little squabble?
Just I think it's real interesting, and I would encourage people who are into this stuff that it's showtime, right? We've got our people and the stuff with Doge or whatever. Like it's really getting down to
really getting
okay, you guys have been complaining for your adult lives, so what do we do? And I realize that we do have a lot of good proposals, but a lot of the stuff, it hasn't been spelled out too much. I will say that when I talked to Nicholas last year, I was surprised at how vague he had been on certain points. And I'm not saying that as a criticism, like as you and I are talking here, I mean, you realize it's a big problem, but I was asking things he was saying, like, the Ecuador model, they dollarize this way. It was more, if I'm not getting mixed up, kind of just forcing people, like basically saying you got 9 months, and then if you're holding the domestic currency, it's no longer legal tender, and it just turns into, so you better turn it into a bank and convert it. Whereas I think it was El Salvador was more like, yeah, you can pay your taxes, or if you go deposit in a bank, we'll switch it over. But if you want to just hang on to it in your wallet or put it under your bed, that's still going to be good forever. And I asked Nicholas, what model are you guys going to use? Or, is Milei going to use? And that hasn't been decided yet. Right. So I'm just saying it was a lot of open-ended stuff where I think it's,
It does make me wonder. Yeah. I mean, I'm excited about Doge too, but I don't see what lever they have to tackle non-discretionary spending. And if that's the case, what can they really do?
You're right. Cutting spending, if it's not allowed, would be tricky, but there's lots of things they could do to like raise revenue, like selling off assets and stuff like that. So I think it'll be a good conversation.
Absolutely. All right. Well, the last thing I want to say on the subject is one more time and with passion, liberimbecile. Thank you, Bob. That was very entertaining and edifying. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching either Haman Nature or the Bob Murphy Show. And go visit all the links and do all the things. Hit likes, hit subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, everybody.